Hi, Stephen. Welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here. How are you, Eric?
I'm doing good. I really was looking forward to this one because I'm a huge fan of 80s hair metal. So I couldn't wait to get into this one. Let's talk about the original book, which came out back in '06, and why you decided to do an expanded edition now.
Well, there's a few different reasons. You do second editions because they do well, right? So that did pretty well. We were kind of the kings of I like to say we were like the kings of the secretaries and the girls, the nurses, and everybody who loves and loved the era. But we also felt like it was we had a lost opportunity with the art direction. It was instead of the way the book is centered now, it was sideways. And I never felt right about it, and the publisher never felt right about it. I don't know how we ended up with that in the first place, but many years go by, the book still sells, and it needed to be re-examined and re-looked at. So it's a combination of, a lot of pages are intact, but there's also lots of stuff that we added. So I think it's really in the spirit of a second edition.
And talk about what's added to this now. We got a new introduction.
Yeah, we have an introduction by Chips Enough from Enough's Enough. And we have an afterwards, I guess you would call it, with Rick Fox, who was this amazing character who played in, he comes out of the original Max's Kansas City, New York Dolls, real glitter rock scene in New York, and then goes to LA and is a founding member of Wasp and comes up with the name Wasp. And he then was in the ultimate Sunset Strip band, Steeler, with Yngwie Malmsteen and Ron Keel. And,
interesting. Ron Keel and Malmsteen. Yeah, Steeler was a name I wasn't familiar with.
Yeah, so that's just one of those bands that they just didn't have, the record didn't really, they had an independent record, but and then of course the ego that is Yngwie Malmsteen just kind of just left after about 12 shows or something like that. So
personality clashes with Yngwie.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and then he has, and his story goes on. He worked with Rick Fox worked with Ronnie James Dio. He had a band called Sin, which the singer Frank C. Starr went on to be in a band called the Four Horsemen that Rick Rubin produced. So he just has been there for every twist and turn, and I just loved having him in there because he was, he was like a big-haired god of the strip back in the day.
Interesting. Your interest in this genre, this era of music, I think is interesting because I read an article where you talk about your friends being pretty surprised to see you write a book about 80s hair metal because your first book, 2001's American Hardcore, covered the birth and evolution of hardcore punk. That was turned into a successful documentary. But what inspired you to write the original book back in 2016? What turned you on to this era?
Well, I always liked that music. I always liked hair metal. I mean, I came out of a very austere, severe subculture that really had no girls. There wasn't really, it was a very, you had to be a very, a very strict kind of character to kind of navigate that world. And when I moved to New York from Washington, D.C., it was just, everything was the same, punk, new wave, hair metal, everybody just hung out, everybody just knew everything. So it was, it didn't seem like, it never really, people who grew up in other cities, they saw this schism and I'm affected by it, but it never really affected me, when I was coming up. So I just, every one of those bands I like, I mean, in that book, I mean, they've all got 2 or 3 good songs. I mean, you have to judge a band by their greatest hits record. And the Poison greatest hits is way better than the Winger greatest hits, let's say.
Poison. Yeah, I was gonna argue for Poison
What a
in
great
this
band. I mean,
interview. Yeah,
you put anybody, go get that best, I'm sure you can hear it on, for free, anywhere. But like the greatest hits album is like 13, 14 songs deep.
they are
You know?
solid songs.
Yeah.
Solid songs. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love that album that they did, Native Tongue with
Oh,
Richie Kotzen.
yeah. Richie
Stand.
Kotzen was so good with that band. Yeah.
Yeah, when I first heard the
And
single
so
Stand, I was
here's what was amazing to me though, was that this was like we could talk about the music but and we both get it, and there's obviously tons of people who get it, but for some reason the artists didn't really get it. There was a social change that happened in the early 90s, and I felt they felt like they had to change or something, and I felt betrayed a little bit by those bands, to be honest with you.
So are
I
you
felt,
talking about like the same bands that were changing their sound to sound like
yeah,
Nirvana?
like I
Right.
felt like, I mean, maybe Cinderella or somebody like that kind of kept it a little bit, but I just felt like everybody was like all of a sudden like in a leather jacket and trying to out tough others, and
Yeah, I don't,
that's not what they were based on. That
right.
wasn't their strength.
There's no way it would have worked. Warrant tried that.
Right.
Was it Ultra, what was the name of that album?
It was like the 95
Ultraphobic or Ultra something. But
yeah.
yeah, and there were bands that were trying to keep up with that era. Even Kiss with Carnival of Souls.
Yeah, right.
And
But Kiss also had this awesome album, and I just know about it because the guy who I made the American Hardcore film with, Paul Rackman, made the videos for the Kiss Revenge album.
Oh, great album. Yes.
Great album.
I guess that could argue against, I guess what we're saying, but it still maintained the Kiss sound. I think it actually brought it more back to the original Kiss.
Album. Yes. But they couldn't keep doing that either. You know what I'm saying? So, you have to really be, it comes down to that thing about, are you honest about your art? And that's a really deep philosophical question. And I don't really have, I can't say that these guys stuck up for their art, in all subjects. But for me as an observer, it's just an incredible story of, a great story, as you know, and a book is beginning, middle, and end, right? Your story and your rise and fall, it's all there. It's like, it's very, the markers are very specific.
I always felt for the bands that came at the tail end because there wasn't much time that they could have in the spotlight. Like Extreme came along at a time and they really broke right towards the end. Mm-hmm. Right towards the end, like 88, 89 with Pornography. Mm-hmm. And there were bands like that I think Trickster was one that came out like 1990.
Yep.
Right before Nirvana and Pearl Jam and all of that. So they kind of get the raw end of the deal, but at least, or they could look at it as the glass half full and say, hey, at least we had our shot, and now they could probably play gigs nowadays and play the hits that they had at the time. But yeah, it just, what Nirvana did was something like we've never seen before. It was like, it just
yeah. I mean, there's these times, as if you go back in your music history, there's like, when Elvis came out, when the Beatles came out, when punk and disco and heavy metal happened. These are all markers, around. But this was it's really a tremendous story. I mean, because these guys were so big and so diluted by the lifestyle, that a lot of them lost themselves. You could tell, right? I've spoken to a lot of these guys since. It was an interesting story. What I think is really important about the book, the specifics of the book, is that all the interviewing, all the interviews, the quotes, the lyrics, the art, it's all from the era. It's all what they said and did in the era. It's not them reflecting on their past, because frankly, a lot of these guys are a little freaked out by their past. They don't want to talk to the wife and kids about what they were doing in 1988.
Yes. You did what?
Yeah, exactly.
That was a long time ago. That was a long time.
No, but that's like a great story in itself. I mean, that's like a
Right.
comedy, but I'm not making fun of these people. I'm really
No,
not.
hey, they were living the dream when I was in high school, and that was
Yeah.
like he just wanted to live that lifestyle.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to find the origins of hair metal. There is a bit of New York Dolls in there. There's some Kiss, early
Mhm.
Kiss, right, with Zeppelin and Van Halen.
Mhm.
But you note the importance of a late '70s band called Angel. Can you talk about their influence and
Well,
the other factors that influenced the hair metal bands of the '80s?
sure. Well, Angel was the first band that credited their hairdresser. I mean, that should pretty much tell you it all. But the specifics of Angel is of a very credible band. They were on cast, they were managed by Bill Aucoin and toured with Kiss. And one Kiss was like the band in black and evil, and these guys were wearing white with the chiffons and the hair. And they Punky Meadows was the leader of that band. They were from Baltimore. Um, I was from the DC area and in those, at that time, and they were a big deal. That was like a band. Like those were really they were wearing white and makeup and stuff, but they were tough. That was a tough, tough band. So I think that really kind of tells you, they're kind of the setup for this scene because none of these guys, I mean, like people used to say like these hair bands were, not tough guys, but it's not like they weren't tough guys. They just weren't tough guys compared to like, I don't know, Danzig or something.
Right.
You know, they were, it wasn't like you would want to start with Nikki Six,
Yeah.
you would, these are like,
Oh,
you
Vince Neil, all those guys, I
know,
wouldn't pick a fight with any of them.
right. So I think that they got caught up in this industry thing, and it all comes down to, well, it starts with Stairway to Heaven, and it starts with Dream On, but it's the power ballad, and the power ballad controlled everything with this particular genre because that's how those bands got on the radio, right? So, you know, um, Agnostic Front was not ready for radio, and they were around at the same time, but you never heard of, bands that came out of the Bad Brains or whatever. You heard about bands that came out of Van Halen, right? And Van Halen really being the be all and end all for that scene in terms of the music structure, which is really the structure of Montrose, which was Sammy Hagar's first band.
Ted Templeman produced it.
You got it. And Ted Templeman and Ronnie Montrose really being the role model for Eddie Van Halen.
Now, when you mentioned the band Angel, is this the same Angel that wanted to record You Really Got Me and release it? Like they overheard Eddie talking about it?
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's a wild story. Like Eddie was just talking to the bass player and saying, "Yeah, we got our first single ready to go out. You Really Got Me." And I
Mhm.
think the bass player was like, "Really?" And so he went back to his band and said, "Hey, we got to record and get it out before they do," type of thing. And Ted
Mhm.
Templeman was like, I think Eddie told Ted, and Ted was like, "What did you do? We got to
Yeah.
get that out now." Yeah, that's a wild story. That is a wild story. But then the other things, Quiet Riot was very important, right? Because they had the very first number one album, very first metal
Sure.
band.
That was 83 into 84.
Right,
And
right.
that's a really, really important time.
It's a
You know,
landmark moment
right,
for
because you,
for
you
metal.
had Ozzy Osbourne who's kind of doing his thing too, but he's still the guy from Black Sabbath, and he's still and he's there wasn't really and they had and he had that whole power with Randy Rhoads, which kind of like made them they were part of like a 70s continuum, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
They were still
Yeah.
kind of the 70s. So when the 80s came, there weren't really many songs. I remember there was that song, and there was Turn Up the Radio by Autograph, and Twisted Sister had one or two songs
Yeah.
because they were getting big, not only in the East Coast, but also in England, which was a big deal. So, yeah, Quiet Riot's a really important part of it. They are also a definitive Sunset Strip band, right? They're kind of like when they started talking about bands on the Strip, you're really talking about bands like Quiet Riot.
Yeah, Come On Feel the Noise was a song that they didn't like.
Yeah.
They didn't want it was Slade that originally did it.
Yep.
And boy, are they glad they released that. And then Stay Hungry from Twisted Sister. And again, both those bands, a lot of showmanship. Of course, Dee
Mhm.
Snider with the outfit, the
Yeah.
look and the makeup and all that stuff. I
Mhm.
mean, that was all part of the package. And it's interesting because those two bands, by the time you get to the end of the 80s, those two bands are gone. I mean,
Mhm.
they're no longer considered cool, but yet they set the bar, like they set the standard for what was to come
Mhm.
after that. But no, Van Halen is really probably right up there in terms of influence. And David Lee Roth was like the front man that everybody wanted to be.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
this book, and the thing is with Dave, him being interviewed, he approached as an art form, which I always loved. So
Mhm.
he would give the greatest quotes. You have quotes from him in this book. There's one I got here. It says the early 80s. Come on, you had some disposable income and you didn't need to wear a condom. That right there gets you through a holiday weekend in style. I was an absolute reflection of that. Yeah,
Yep.
I can't think of anybody who's more quotable from that era. Like I said, like an art form. Was he the most quotable guy, you think, or who are the names that come
Yeah.
to
Well,
mind
I
who
mean,
are just
there's the two guys who are the ultimate pros who I always point to are him and Gene Simmons, right?
Gene Simmons? Yeah.
Yeah.
And Paul
So
was pretty good too. Paul had a lot.
yeah, nothing. I didn't mean to detract from Paul.
Paul, yeah.
It's just the overarching impact of Gene Simmons. But those
But
two
that went a
guys
long
are
way to
like
promote a band too, man. You got to get out there and promote. That's why Dave was so important for Van Halen too, because Ed was
yeah.
shy and Dave was a guy
Those
like,
guys were like those guys understood show business. You know, they come out of showbiz families, at least Dave did, and they just knew how to do that Broadway-ish kind of thing. And it was cool. I mean, those were those guys are the kind of guys, and I know this from interviewing both of them a number of times. It's like you turn on the tape and you turn it off 45 minutes later, and you're not going to get a word in edgewise.
yeah, that you have a hard time keeping up with Dave, right?
Yeah,
How
of
many
course. Yeah.
questions do you get in? Yes, a few. Tops. Two.
Yeah. And he's one of those guys where like, most of the stuff goes over your head while you're listening to it. And then when you go back and hear it, it's like, wow.
Well, do you think he rehearses those things in his head when he's on downtime, or is this just his brain? He's got
I
that
just think
brain.
it's his brain because I don't think because he would have been much more efficient in the business if it wasn't just his head going off all the time.
Right, because I've seen interviews with him where he's fielding questions that weren't the standard questions, and boom, he just responds. He's like on it. He has an
Yeah.
answer for everything.
Yeah. No, he represented I mean, it was showbiz, right? I guess I never really thought of hair metal as showbiz, but it certainly is. It certainly is. I mean, and I mean that in the best way, because there is nothing wrong with showbiz. We're all so inundated with it. You can't just pick and choose and decide when you like it.
Yeah,
It's like,
he was the guy back in the VHS days. I would record Dave interviews every bit as much as I would record a song that was new on MTV. It was
mhm,
like I can't wait to watch Dave talk his rap.
mhm. And
We,
the way you're talking right here. I mean, this is why I wrote this book. I mean,
it was
this is
fun.
like a cool time in history.
Oh,
It's enough time now. You asked me why about the second edition is also another 20 years is a long time. And I really have, I've been able to really think everything through as well. And it's about enough time. It's about enough time that because what happens historically with a lot of things is when it's just over, nobody cares. When it just ended, nobody cares. But you need the breathing time to reflect on it. And these guys come up, they're pretty cool. There's yeah, a lot of my punk rock friends were surprised that I showed such enthusiasm for such a subject. I don't think they were surprised that I did it because they know I have a very wide interest in music. But I think my obsession with the Vinnie Vincent Invasion and Nitro and some of the most extreme, like weird, almost weird bands. I think that kind of blew their mind. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the best lyric, or the lyric that sums up that whole era the best, I think, is Poison, Nothing But a Good Time. And it's, if
Mhm.
wanting the good life is such a crime, Lord, then put me away.
Right.
Yeah, and
That's
and
it.
that was what that era was about. There are bands you highlight in the book who weren't as big as Bon Jovi or Motley Crue or Def Leppard. Is there a band or a few bands that come to mind where you think, man, those guys should have been bigger? Like
Well,
Blue
I mean, they're kind
Murders
of
one.
they're
I think of
like
Blue
there's
Murders.
this one band that's on in there called XYZ.
Yep.
They're from Southern California, and they were kind of like Bad Company meets like hair metal, like modern metal. I thought they were an amazing band. There was a band called Badlands with Ray Gillen,
Yes, that had also on
Jake E.
guitar,
Lee, Jake
Jake
E.
E. Lee
Lee.
on guitar.
Yeah, right. So that was a really good band. That's good. That record's almost like, Bon Jovi had this really cool era. I grew up in New Jersey, like the town next to Sayreville, New Jersey, which is
Oh,
where John is from.
right
And
there. Yeah.
yeah, so I used to like I kind of I played Pop Warner football with Richie Sambora.
Get out.
Yeah, so I kind of knew those guys,
Was he a good football player?
Yeah, he was good. Yeah, he
That's
was
so
good.
cool, man.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So I was, from that area. So, but they had this one really cool era, which is the soundtrack for it's a movie that a Western, you know what I'm talking about?
Right, right.
They
Oh,
did the
wait, are we
song called
talking about Young Guns? Are we talking about that
Yeah,
one?
Young Guns.
John brought in Jeff Beck to do the soundtrack to Young Guns.
Right, right. So that's kind of like a
Yep.
cool, that's kind of like what Badlands kind of reminds
Yeah,
me of.
yeah. That had Miracle, and the
Oh
big
yeah.
hit, the big hit was Blaze of Glory.
Blaze of Glory,
But
yeah.
yeah, Jeff Beck was on
Yeah.
that. But to me, Bon Jovi, and I know Slippery When Wet, how huge that was in '86. But New Jersey to me is it. Like
Uh,
that's my favorite Bon Jovi album, especially the songs that weren't on the radio. That's side two is
yeah. The you just said that those two albums though, Slippery When
oh
Wet in New Jersey.
huge.
Although I'll put in how about this one? I'll put in a word for 78 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit,
Yes.
which is their second album,
Yep.
which isn't like their best album, and they probably almost went out of business. A lot of bands have those wobbly, wonky second albums. And but it had In and Out of Love,
In and Out of Love. And Silent Night
right? Silent Night.
is
Yeah.
on
So
there. Yep.
they were always really good. They always had like a really like John's like a really smart guy, and he's always like observing, you know, and he's always paying attention. So and his band reflects that. I mean, he didn't change that. It's very interesting because he didn't have to change too much to yet still completely leave whatever negative stereotypes there could have been from the 80s.
They got
Like
the
it's not like he changed that much, it's like Have a Nice Day or something like that he put out like a few years later. It's still like She's a Little Runaway or something.
man,
It's still kind of
Bounce.
like
Do you remember
it's still got
Bounce?
that, yeah.
Bounce. Yeah, that was early 2000s. But they're interesting because, well, actually, they have a documentary out now. John Bon Jovi just put out
Oh, I
on
didn't know
the
that.
history of Bon Jovi. So he's out promoting that. And
Wow.
he's talking about how he lost his voice. He's trying to get it back. He's able to sing here and there. He recorded an album, but on tour, he's like, it's up to God at this point. He gets up every morning and he does vocal lessons, but he lost it. And I think it had to do with his getting COVID. But do you think, because he did, I think he tried to distance himself from that
He
rock
did.
label. They cut his hair short and then
Yeah.
did Keep the Faith, which is, it's a great
Right.
album. But then it was interesting because, like, during the '90s, they were holding on with ballads. It seemed like that
Right.
was the only, like, Always and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
then it was It's My Life in
Mhm.
late '90s that brought him
Which is
back
great. Which is
to.
great. Yeah.
But that was
Great
a
song.
brilliant move because you still had Richie's talk box in there, so it was like
Mhm.
a connection of old school Bon Jovi with a new sound. But man, those guys, I mean, when if he goes back out on tour again, I mean, they'll sell out Giants Stadium.
Mhm. Yeah, they're they're one of the biggest bands in the world. I mean, and they're not that, they're not an aloof band. They're not like you would think they would be. It's like you couldn't get like 10 feet from 30 feet from U2. And I'm not even putting them down. But that's like unapproachable kind of stuff.
Approachable, yeah. You like John is the kind of guy you could probably run into, and he'd shake
Yeah,
your
like I
hand.
ran into him and I ran into Richie both in the past like dozen years, let's say. And it was very normal.
That's
Like,
cool.
Richie, I don't know how much John remembered me or just said he remembered me, but I used to review them for Kerrang and all those kind of magazines. So I think he did remember me a little bit.
You
But I
know,
mean, he took
Richie.
10 minutes to talk, so I mean, it's like,
Listen, I mean, he's a mega star,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's just cool. That just tells you how down to earth he is. But Richie's really cool because I just saw on social media he posted it was a woman who was a huge Bon Jovi fan. She was like the number one Bon Jovi fan, loved the band, everything you did, and she passed away. And Richie, rest in peace. I mean, they're giving her some love on social media, again, that just speaks to how they feel about their fans and just normal
They're
dude.
really like, I mean, Jersey's very normal, kind of a normal place. They're very Jersey, they really, even though they moved to other places and stuff, they are that. Like
Is Richie underrated as a guitarist?
yes, very
Yeah, yeah,
underrated guitar
yeah.
player because of the band he was in. And that's why he's not in the band, really, if you ask me, is because he wasn't treated like Jeff Beck.
Yeah,
And he's not Jeff Beck, but he's a good guitar. I mean, I've seen him warm up before shows. It's pretty impressive.
bluesy guitarist. He's got some
Yeah.
solid solo work. Yeah, it's he kind of had to take a back seat, and I think John has said they asked him if he's talked to Richie because there was this talk that Richie was going to come back. Maybe Phil X is the guitarist now, but then I think John said I haven't talked to him in a while. So hey, maybe it'll happen. What about if you were to compare Slippery and New Jersey to Def Leppard's Pyromania and Hysteria? If you had to choose which two for in your
For
own
me, I
personal
mean,
opinion.
look, I there's nothing. I mean, Pyromania is just is a classic album. But you're talking to somebody from Jersey, so it's kind of like,
Oh, that's right. What am I saying?
it's a kind of a hard one for me to
Yeah,
like. I don't even love I don't love Bruce Springsteen, but I will always stand up for him. It's just a
yeah,
central Jersey thing. I can't really explain it.
yeah. Do you
Yeah.
feel is there the best of the best in terms of this era in the '80s as far as an album? To me, Hysteria, I think you
Um,
have to put right. I mean, that
yeah.
was massive.
Well, there's a lot of stuff. We've talked about a lot of this stuff. I think back on the 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 Richie Kotzen Poison album. I mean, that's an incredible record by any stretch. That's like a classic 70s rock record.
I know, and it just came and went. And I think because number one, people wanted CC DeVille, and number two, I
Mhm.
think times were changing.
Right.
But you're right, that is a solid album.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really brilliant album. And it's such a hard question. I mean, do you put Guns N' Roses in there?
Oh,
You
Appetite.
know?
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I mean
the Appetite
that whole era of Guns N' Roses, I mean, that and the acoustic album that they,
lies.
I mean, that whole era is, or even like there's, they put out the two albums at once, Use Your Illusion, 1 and 2.
Right.
If that was one album, that would be like a top 100 album of all time.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
there's a bunch of old songs that they sneak onto those records that were supposed to be on the first album, and there's a whole bunch of them. I mean, there's probably like that's a hard one. I think a really underrated band is LA Guns.
oh yes.
Yeah, I think Phil is a great singer. I think Tracy Guns is, obviously underrated. I think of Warren DeMartini as an underrated guitar player from Rat. I think that was a band when they were on and not like socially and chemically diluted, but like actually playing music. They were unstoppable. I mean, Robin Crosby, Bobby Blotzer, Stephen Pearcy, Warren DeMartini, and
Did you say Crucier, Juan Crucier?
no, Juan
Yeah,
Croucier,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Oh, they were by the mid '80s. They were like the biggest band around.
And
But
really good because they were kind of like they kept the old school Aerosmith thing alive.
they did, yeah. There was comparisons to Aerosmith. The album we were just mentioning, Appetite for Destruction. A lot of people will say is like a bridge between the hair metal era and grunge, because they weren't hair metal. Like Axl had the poofed up hair in the video for Welcome to the Jungle, but that didn't
Yeah.
last long. And Skid Row is another one too, where they weren't a glam band.
Yeah, yeah. Skid Row is a great. Yeah, I can't believe I didn't mention them. Again, Jersey, right?
Yep.
Got their gig. They got their start opening for John Bon Jovi,
That's
right? Bon
right.
Jovi is the guy who got them started, and they were lucky. They struck gold when they found the singer from Toronto, Sebastian Bach, because that came through like a photographer or something. That was like a totally random kind of thing, but it made the band because they were kind of not signable before that. They
I
didn't
love
really,
the little trivia stuff, like his brother played in the NHL. He was a goaltender.
is that right?
Yes, Sebastian Bach's brother
That I did
is
not
an
know.
ML. I mentioned a band, though, Blue Murder, earlier. Do
Oh
you,
yeah.
do you remember that? John Sykes from Whitesnake.
Carmine Appice.
Yes,
Great band. Great band.
really good band, really good band. Stephen Blush is the author of American Hair Metal, Can't Get Enough. Here's a Tommy Lee quote regarding how easy it was for these guys to get women. He said, quote, "I remember it being so natural for there to be 50 girls in any city naked backstage. No one would think twice about any of it." And then Rat had the condom vending machine. You talk about that on the tour bus in the book. Warrant traveled with a groupie computer. What, what
Because
was the
it was like it was like a big computer back then.
There's another band. Janie Lane was a solid songwriter. Very
Right.
sad story that alcohol, just that was his demon. But Cherry Pie, the album with Uncle Tom's
Oh my God.
Cabin, and Blind Faith is on there. I mean,
Great
yeah,
band.
it's too bad because once the '90s came around, they become like a punchline. But
Well, I
you
think
know,
he's the one in the book who makes the comment that I went over to Columbia and Alice in Chains posters were on the
yeah.
wall and I knew it
Oh,
was over.
what a
That was
story.
a weird era because that's the time that I was around. I was around a lot of the grunge bands because they had been hardcore, a lot of those guys. So I kind of, that's kind of like, and there was this time where if you were like Soundgarden or Alice in Chains or Pearl Jam or Faith No More, you had to take these tours with like, Poison or Extreme or,
Yeah.
whoever it was. You had to tour with you had to open for those bands.
Yeah, it was an odd pairing. Like Alice in Chains opened for Van Halen in '91.
Mhm.
But a lot of people forget too, like Alice in Chains, I think, was a band who, when they first started out, they were kind of sort of glam the way they
Well,
dressed
yeah,
up,
because it was hard to make the break, right?
Yeah.
You live a certain life, you like rock and roll, and then all of a sudden you see how the business is, and you see how the big cities are changing, and you want to be ahead of that, but you can't be too ahead of it because you'll come across as fake, So it's like it's a really hard thing to straddle, like authenticity. You have to be authentic, whatever you do. Like I never felt like Poison was not authentic,
Right. That's who they were.
but these bands became inauthentic when they changed. I'm not saying that Poison changed because they didn't. You know, in fact, I would say that Bret Michaels did a very mature thing, which was kind of like that country, that going more Nashville, let's say. Because that's what you do when you get older. You mature and you take your tools and you move into something else. That's okay.
And he,
Um,
he does well on his own. He's got his own festival that he puts out once a year,
mhm,
does the Poison thing.
mhm.
He's
Yeah. And
smart.
it's like, and there's like there are millions of people who love these bands still. and it's starting to become more of an international market, maybe. That's what I'm noticing. Like Germany, like you could bring every one of these bands there for play to
Yeah, isn't
sell
that
out
wild?
soccer stadiums. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Hey guys, quick heads up from the grooming front lines. Shaving your jewels doesn't have to be a risky business anymore. Thanks to our friends at Manscaped and their Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra, you can forget about nicking your bits. This trimmer is all about keeping your things smooth and safe, so you can trim with confidence. Fancy a stress-free shave and some savings? Head over to manscaped.com now and save 20% off plus free shipping by using the code BOOKEDONROCK. With Manscaped, it's easy grooming and no surprises. Guys, don't be like me. Don't use a cheap razor, because if you do, get yourself a lot of Band-Aids. It's going to be a war zone down there. This 5th generation trimmer features 2 interchangeable next-gen skin-safe blade heads. A standard one for taking a little off the top and a new foil blade to go smooth wherever your heart desires. With dual LED spotlights, you'll achieve better visibility, making every trim more precise and hassle-free. And guys, if you're worried about making a mess, don't worry. This thing's good in the shower, in the tub, in the ocean. And if that's not all, it comes in a nice traveling case so you can take it wherever you go. Get 20% off plus free shipping at manscaped.com. Use the code BOOKEDONROCK. That's 20% off plus free shipping by using the code BOOKEDONROCK. Show your balls some love. Feel free as a dove. How about Kiss in the 80s? An interesting band to talk about because I'm a huge fan of 80s Kiss, but I get it. They were following trends rather than setting them in the 70s. But what's your opinion of Kiss during that decade?
Well, first of all, I love Vinnie Vincent, right? I think Vinnie Vincent, he wrote Lick It Up, a few other songs I'm not thinking of right now.
Well, yeah, he's on Creatures of the Night, which was Aces on the cover, but it's
Aces on the cover.
And then he wrote songs off of Revenge. They brought him back
They brought him back and he sued him again. He sued them again.
Yeah.
I mean, like so crazy. I mean, this guy's like, you're in Kiss, it's really hard to get thrown out of that band. It's like he had definitely taken the band up a notch. So, okay, so you go from Kiss of the 70s, which is like one of the biggest franchises ever. And then I just wrote this book called When Rock Met Disco, which is about how bands went disco around 1980, like Rod Stewart, Do You Think I'm Sexy?
Stones,
Miss You. And the big one in this discussion is I Was Made for Loving You, which in 1979, they go from stadiums to tanking. Like they're literally like playing like theaters.
Half empty arenas.
Yeah, half empty arenas.
Yeah.
And it's so there's this amazing book. I wish I could know the title or the author's name, but it was a book I read about 20 years ago. It was by Kiss's accountant. If you could ever get your hands on that one, it's unbelievable because he has no empathy for the subject at all. He's just talking numbers. So
I think I know about this one. Hold
on. You got to find it. I don't know what the name of it is. I don't know who the author was, and I apologize for that.
No, I think I could maybe find. I typed quickly book by Kiss accountant.
Book by Kiss accountant.
Yeah, I mean,
it is like really, so unbelievable how fast it went down. I guess.
Wait a minute, is it here? Here it is. Kiss and Sell: The Making of a Supergroup.
Yeah.
That's a really well-known book in the Kiss world.
Kiss and Sell, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, with Music from the Elder just bombs, and then they put out a best of that had some new songs on there with Eric Carr, a little harder, but they went ignored, and then comes Creatures of the Night, which is just a fantastic album, but
great album.
Ignored because,
but then it was weird because, like you just said, the Elder was like this, like a head scratcher. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then there's like Crazy Nights. Like, what album is that?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about Crazy Nights because that's an album most Kiss fans don't like, and I love Crazy Nights. That came out in '87. That's got Turn on the Night, Reason to Live, and then the title track kind of sort of because they call it Crazy Nights. That's the song. But yeah, there was a friend of mine, an author, Greg Prato, who wrote a book on Kiss in the '80s, was talking about how if that album came out just like 1 year before, it would have done much better. But I think by the time that came out, Welcome to the Jungle was out, so Appetite was out, so things were kind of starting to shift towards more of that like Skid Row, Guns N' Roses, like gritty rock
Mhm.
and roll thing. And so it did amazing numbers in Europe, Crazy Nights, but
Right.
here not so
You could
much.
follow the nuance. See, Kiss, Gene and Paul are so smart about like understanding culture that you follow every one of those records you just mentioned, and you could follow every current of music, the subcurrent, I guess you would call it, as it goes through.
It's fascinating to follow, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because Crazy Nights is basically a hair metal record.
Yeah. Yeah. Ron
Yeah.
Nevison came in and he did all those heart songs, and
Mhm.
they thought that was going to be the big one. But also they were smart enough to take the makeup off in '83. That
Mhm.
got them enough attention and drew attention to the Lick It Up album.
Yeah.
And then from that point on, it was like Paul really led the way. He was the ideal
Yeah, he was
frontman.
like the front man.
Yeah, and he was writing the songs, at least one hit single off of each album, right up until that reunion. Yeah, David Lee Roth, we talked about his inspiration, how many frontmen he inspired. But Eddie Van Halen inspired so many of the guitarists from the 80s. Vito Bratta, we haven't talked about from White Lion. What was and it still is my favorite of the Eddie disciples. Who are the best guitarists from that era? You did mention uh,
I was saying guys like Warren DeMartini.
DeMartini.
Um,
How
and I
about
was saying guys like well, Jakey Lee on his
mhm,
own. That's a really good era of Ozzy Osbourne. I can't remember the drummer's
Shot in the
name.
Dark?
Who's the drummer who played on the 1986 album, 1987 album, 88? What would
Yeah,
that
I'm
be?
gonna look it up. I'm gonna look it up here.
It
Yeah,
had
because
what where like Ozzy's like on a throne.
oh yeah,
I mean, that's really good stuff, you
he's
know?
on Bark at the Moon, Jakey Lee.
Yeah.
Uh,
The one after that.
yeah, I gotta find the discography here. See, because I'm wondering, I think Zach Wilde is on that one you're referring to, though. That's the one with Miracle Man,
Oh yeah,
Crazy
Zach is on that.
Babies. Yep.
But the tour was definitely
But Jake was on Shot in the Dark,
Shot in the Dark. That's what I'm thinking of.
You Bark at the Moon.
Yeah.
He was on
But
those.
Shot in the Dark, what's the name of that album?
Boy, I'm trying to quickly find. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Let's see. No Rest for the Wicked came
Oh,
out in
Rest for the
'88,
Wicked.
but The
Yeah.
Ultimate Sin from
Yeah,
'86
that's
is the
what I'm saying.
one.
Yeah.
Shot in the Dark, The Ultimate Sin, Lightning Strikes was on there.
Yeah, that was a great
And
tour. That was the tour that they were opening for. That the opening band was a young band from San Francisco called Metallica.
yes, you're right.
Yeah,
Killer of Giants was one of my favorites.
yeah,
Killer of
yeah. It's
Giants.
really so. I mean,
Red Beach
you
is
know,
another one from Winger.
yeah, Red Beach, amazing. And you just said Zach Wild. I don't know if he's part of this conversation, but Jersey guy, but also like incredible. Just a minute about Vito Bratta, maybe.
Yeah, man.
It was, they're from Staten Island, which is like the outer reaches of New York City. It's just kind of like it's like a world unto itself. It's like Saturday Night Fever. I mean, it really that's what they are. So these guys were just like Saturday Night Fever, but with like long hair, you know. Vito, I don't think wanted to tour. I think he just wanted to stay in Staten Island. But what a guitar player. I mean,
Amazing.
he was a little stiff sometimes, like live. I don't think he was ever really comfortable with it.
Hmm.
You have to have kind
Yeah.
of like a real panache, I think is the word for to be a lead guitarist. You really have to want it. Like, I
Well,
don't know if
maybe
you
that's
know
why,
the
because he
story of
stepped away and never came back. I mean,
yeah,
once the grunge era came, he was like, "I'm done." Never came back.
yeah. Yeah, so like I knew the guys from Typo Negative and they're from the same kind of stuff. And it's like they just stopped playing. They have day jobs. You're like, why would you do music when you have a day job? So
Yeah,
that makes you a really regular guy in my view,
yeah,
right? But
yeah.
but it's like
Vito, I guess
it's not what people want to hear of their stars.
no.
But
Well, Mike Tramp, the singer of White Line, he never stopped making music. Does his
yeah,
solo work, plays
yeah.
clubs. He's
Mhm.
just that's it's who he is. But Vito, I think his father got ill. I think maybe and he was taking care of his dad, and
Yeah, yeah, there
just
was something to do with that.
did a few interviews here and there with Eddie Trunk and
Mhm.
people begging and pleading, please come back. But
Eddie was a really important piece of all this too, because
sure.
he's again Jersey guy, but he was in the trenches for all these bands. And that wasn't always a popular thing to do. You know, it's hip, it's cool to some people, but not cool to others, right? So I don't care. I think it's all cool. I mean,
Hey,
that's my view on music. If
yeah,
you like it, it's good, really.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. We didn't mention Whitesnake either, man. Vivian Campbell,
yeah,
John
Vivian Campbell.
Sykes, Stevie Vai was on Roth's
Yeah,
Skyscraper, Eat 'em and Smile and Skyscraper, but then he's on Slip of the Tongue,
right.
Whitesnake. But yeah, I mean, Coverdale, one of the best
Yeah.
voices. And
Mhm.
now we want to talk about there's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So there's a lot of partying back in those days. And one of the quotes that really got my attention, there's so many great quotes in this book, by the way, but one of them that got my attention was from Sebastian Bach. And he said, quote, puking is the second best release to orgasm. I dig it. When I puke, it's totally righteous. It's so great. It's like a total release of heaviness. It's like an orgasm coming out of your mouth. It's sexual. I mean, that speaks to the mindset of that
Yeah.
era, right? Regarding
Oh, yeah.
alcohol and plenty of drugs, including cocaine. Don Dawkins said he didn't know one band in LA that wasn't doing coke. But how much of that sex,
Oh, by
drugs,
the
and rock?
way, yeah, can I just interrupt
Yep.
with that? I'll answer your question, but
Yeah.
another great guitar player is George Lynch.
Oh, geez, yeah,
Yeah,
from
it's the
Dokken,
guitar player from
of
Dokken.
course. Yeah,
Yeah,
him and Don have always had trouble getting along, but
yeah.
but no doubt, man, he wasn't still his great guitarist. But how much of that sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing was real, and how much of it was just playing it up for image? You
I
mentioned you
don't
talk
think it was
about
played up for image.
it
I
was real,
don't.
it was
It
sincere, it
was
was like
real,
this
yeah,
is
because that was just what you were supposed to do. And I didn't really get that part either. This is why I'm kind of like holding up okay at my old age. But like, there were certain of these things that people took that I just never really got. Um, and the Coke thing is like this huge thing. It's like this thing where it's all about ego. Like you're all about yourself. It's like this hypomania kind of thing. That like you're just totally consumed with yourself, and it just fit that lifestyle so perfectly because that's what everybody was anyway, right? And it
yes.
just hyped it up to different levels. And these guys, let's face it, when they're dressed like that in their hometown, they either do or they don't meet the girl. But when they're dressed on stage like that, they're stars.
Remember in 1996 the MTV Video Awards when Dave came up there with Van Halen and everybody was so excited. Oh my God, David Lee's back! And then it all fell apart. And Eddie later said at that time he needed a hip surgery. So Eddie's telling the press, not sure what's happening. We don't know. I need to get my hip worked on. Blah, 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 blah. And Eddie said, Dave pulls him aside. He goes, hey man, tonight's about me, man, not your fucking hip. There you go. It's
Yeah.
like it's all about me.
No,
And he used to call it LSD, lead singer disease. It's
yeah.
like it's all about me. But that
Right.
was
No, that's the whole thing. It's like I think where people get tripped up with this music is that you try to analyze what that is, and and what you're describing just is. It's just like it's just like this thing that people did or people do or people buy into. It's just it's pretty universal. I mean, I don't see any great surprise in any of this. I think
yeah.
what it's like this is what they wanted to do. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, like the whole this is what they, you know, they the life like the t-shirts were in the 70s, sex and drugs and rock and roll, but not everybody lived it. People are starting to live it, but these guys like, took it as like hook, line, and sinker,
Yeah.
as their lives. And I can't think about who it actually helped. Because there's some, you can make an intellectual argument for psychedelics, let's say, or cannabis, but these other things like there's no happy ending. There's no like it's not helping your body in any way. It's not helping your mind. It's not, nothing. So, and the amount of money spent on that is like a book in itself. What did these bands do when they got $250,000? They spent 100 grand of it on coke or something, right?
Just living
So
like there's no tomorrow.
yeah,
That's it. By the way, I forgot to mention Randy Castillo's the drummer on Ozzy's.
yeah,
Is that the one you're
yeah.
referring
That's
to?
what I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
thinking of. I was thinking that he was a really great drummer. Yeah.
yeah. I think when Sammy joined Van Halen, it was like good timing because the power ballads was becoming huge by the time he joined in '86,
Mhm.
and Dave wasn't a power ballad guy. But what are the best power ballads of that era, in your opinion? We mentioned
Um,
Every Rose Has Its Thorn. Well, Home Sweet Home.
yeah, I mean, you got to put all those in there, right?
I mean, Home Sweet Home, I think, was like the first one. When you mentioned Zeppelin Stairway to Heaven,
Yeah,
that set it up, but it wasn't until, I don't think, Home Sweet Home until
because
record
what
companies
was
started
what
taking
was cool
notice.
about that song, if I remember correctly, that's on Theater of Pain. It's a really bombastic album that has that as a closing song or a closing side.
But
I
that's
mean, but
when the
that's such an
record
intense
labels
album.
took notice of that, though. Like, oh, here we go. And
Yeah.
then Sebastian would later talk about how they all had the game plan. Like, the lead single is going to be the hard rocker. Second single is the ballad. Third single might be like a mid tempo. But
I always thought the
once,
third or the fourth song is what I wanted to hear.
right?
I always thought that was the killer song. I mean, of course, the first song, yes, you're correct. But
Interesting. Yeah.
it was always like not the second one, but it was like the third one that was always like the one that would catch you. I always found.
Janie
But
Lane wrote some great ballads, Heaven and I Saw Red. I mean, those were just money makers. They were,
he was really good. You know, it was really sad. Like I wrote his obituary for Spin magazine, and I
did you?
all his
Wow.
old friends, I couldn't get them to talk. Like they were all just like, you know, it was just so too much bad blood. Like,
There was a lot of bridges burned.
yeah,
Very sad.
yeah, it was very sad. I
Very
spoke
sad.
spoke to his wife and all. Yeah, I mean, it was like she threw him out of the house at that time, so she was feeling awful. You know.
Yeah, boy, and he was a talent, and I don't think he ever got past that whole thing when that he talked about Cherry Pie. That song, it was like they just asked him to write a song like "Love in an Elevator" from Aerosmith. He's like, oh, okay, and then like he writes it that night, comes back next day, gives it to them, and the album was to be called Uncle Tom's Cabin, but now it's called Cherry Pie. The lead single is Cherry
Mhm.
Pie. The covers changed to all that, and I think that really bummed him out because I think he wanted to be taken seriously as a musician, as an artist. But
There's a whole other thing where I didn't even go into it in the book. It's just like so dark and effed up. It's like well, there are two stories. There's one that it's more than a rumor. You could look it up. But Janie Lane was abused by somebody in the business.
Bobby Brown, his ex-wife, said
She wrote that in her book.
she's
Yes.
gone public with it, so it's
Yeah.
out there. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not a
And there's
that's
also the thing about Ray Gillen, who sang in Badlands, um, had HIV and gave it knowingly to a bunch of women
and
before
that's
time.
that's why that band is not recognized the way they should be because it's kind of like nobody wants to touch that.
They didn't I have a friend who's a DJ on Ozzy's Boneyard, and I was telling him this story, and he refused to believe me. And I'm like, dude, I wouldn't be telling you this story if I, this is some dark stuff, right? So, but apparently the record company stopped selling it because that way there'd be no judgment against them. Because as soon as they accepted money for it, it was like going to get sued for it.
Yeah,
So, these guys were, it wasn't like so innocent. That's, I guess, what I'm getting.
the Vince Neil story,
Yeah, Vince Neil. Oh my
Razzie
gosh.
from
Yep. Yeah, I
um,
mean, he killed somebody and basically nothing happened to his career, right? So
cool pieces of trivia from the book. You feature a bunch of the biggest bands, and it's cool. You list the band's birthplace, the band members, essential haircuts, and fascinating facts. And I had no idea that Warrant were named after rat guitarist Warren DeMartini.
yeah, it was like,
That's cool.
yeah, there was probably some like late night drug thing or something, but they Warrant, yeah.
That is cool. And then you finish the book with an interview with Rick Fox, who you say is, quote, the greatest name in heavy metal you never heard of. How come many have not heard of him? Like,
I don't know. I've delved into this subject before. I wrote a book called Lost Rockers, and it's about great musicians who fell through the cracks of history. Like, why don't you know them? Why don't you know that Jake Holmes wrote Dazed and Confused, or that Robert Fleischman was the original singer of Journey, who wrote
Yes.
Wheel in the Sky, or that Gloria Jones, who did the original version of Tainted Love, was in T-Rex with her husband, Mark Bolan. It's like, why don't we know so this just is he's just another person in that kind of list of that. Why don't you make it? It's so now we're talking about like the psychology of why you don't make it. And I've had this conversation a lot. I've talked to my wife about it because she's not in the business. And you just have to have like a lot of ego. You got to like really push. If you're like, oh, it's cool, no problem, it's cool. Doesn't matter if you worked with the Stones or the Beatles or Andy Warhol or the Velvet Underground or whatever amazing things these people had done. It's just, it didn't happen. And if you follow music realistically, it's like there's only like one band from every genre who gets recognized. I mean, you could take I was really into the whole punk, hardcore, new wave undergrounds of the late 70s and early 80s. And I mean, the only band that basically exists as a name from new wave is U2, right? Like it's almost like all the other like, does anybody know who Julian Cope was? Who had the band The Teardrop Explodes, who was like rivals with U2.
That's cool. I just interviewed the guy from the Wild Swans.
Oh yeah. Okay, there you go.
The
Um,
Wild Swans. He was mentioning that band.
yeah. It's so the really like, these are
Paul
like really
Simpson.
important bands, like to certain people. Like, I mean, some bands are good at like, recognizing who influenced them, so people kind of know who Killing Joke and the Misfits were because of Metallica. Basically if people know heavy metal, they know Metallica, right? They don't know, or they know AC/DC. They don't know Megadeth. They don't know Slayer. They don't know, they can't name those songs like they could, or, maybe I'm not using the right examples there, but nobody comes near. There's like one band that's just huge. There's the Foo Fighters and there's nobody else. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? And that's just kind of how it's become like conversation points.
I always wondered too, is it well, timing, opportunity meets talent. It's got to be the timing, but also if you have one hit single, maybe just the mainstream media will pick up on that band more so than the others, and they kind of take off from there.
Yeah, people get anointed. Guns N'
Right.
Roses were anointed. Pearl Jam were anointed. Like I was around when the big people said this band's going to be big, and that's you know how it works a lot of the time. Usually,
Yeah.
there's money under the table, those kinds of things. Like
Well, and also the
Taylor Swift
labels, right?
said,
The labels would focus their attention,
yeah,
their money,
yeah,
their A&R guy all on that one or two or three maybe bands.
right.
And
And
then
then
the others that are on the roster are a lot down on the bottom and they just kind of forget about them.
right, like how many bands could you rattle off from the '90s really, other than Nirvana? I mean, maybe you and I could, but
Yeah.
whatever,
Like
but it's not much.
Silverchair and those
Yeah,
bands that kind of
you're running out of names already. Wait, I thought presidents of the United States of America,
right. Oh my
but like I
God,
can't,
yeah.
there's not, there,
Well,
there's
and
not a lot.
look at the movie from 1988, The Decline of Western Civilization Part
Mhm.
2, and
Yep.
all of those bands that were in there, these young kids that they're just this is it for me. I don't know. Somebody asked them, what do you do if this doesn't happen? They're like, no, it will happen, And it was like it's a nobody. Nobody even recognizes who it is, so he never made it. So eventually, yeah, they gotta find in the '90s. A lot of those guys had to find work. Some of them would do like real estate work and stuff. I remember Alice Cooper here in Connecticut. Alice Cooper, the drummer, was doing real estate. Neil Smith, I remember,
Yeah, Neil
they
Smith
were
did real estate. Yeah,
just doing
I know that.
yeah, they were doing some
Very
local
high end real
show.
estate, by the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were doing some local show in Fairfield County, and he called into the radio station I was working at, and he just Yeah, I mean that's the reality. You gotta, and then the sad reality too is you got bands like the Great White. Like I saw Jack Russell up on stage recently, and he was struggling, but he needs, he needs to make the money. So yeah, last question for you is we've seen obviously some huge tours: Mötley Crüe, Def Leppard with Poison and Joan Jett. Huge numbers. Guns N' Roses still a huge touring act. So where do you see this era of music now in terms of modern culture? Like, is it just for people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, or are we seeing a younger audience show up
I
at
think
these?
there's a sizable smaller audience, but it's still essentially the larger older audience. And that's my question about the future of rock and roll. Like it doesn't seem like like kids right now don't seem very rock and roll. They don't really seem to have like a spirit of revolution, of rebellion, of like wanting to say things that are controversial or do things that are edgy. Like that's not, there's like a new conformity that's going on, in our society, and it's just a matter of how much you remember of the past. And I don't think people, for judging from what I see, I don't think people know much about history at all. But you like to think that rock and roll is eternal. Um, I guess I have to keep hoping that it is. But there is it, but every time this has been going on for 40, 50 years, the older people all say, this music's over with, or the younger people say, you know, that's old people's music. And that's just like a natural current. So maybe we're just going through those currents as well.
I hope I'm wrong and you're wrong about that, but it's kind of bumming me out because
Yeah.
we really need a band or an artist that's total rock and roll, like for the young generation to grasp onto, and that will then be like that's like planting the seeds for a whole nother generation. But boy, once these bands are like Guns N' Roses and Crüe and Def Leppard, and what do you do when these bands are gone? I
Yeah.
mean,
Like, yeah,
it's like,
you don't replace Motorhead. They've been gone for 5, 10 years, or the
right?
Ramones. You
Yeah.
don't replace that.
So it's like, what happens from here on out? Is it just like here in Connecticut, the big venue, the summer venue used to always have rock shows. Now it's all country and hip
Yep.
hop. And
Yep.
it's like,
Yep.
this is bumming me out.
Mhm.
Hey,
Well,
but when Eddie Van Halen died, it was like a whole chunk of my youth was just removed,
of course.
and you
And
never
he
get it
wasn't that
back.
old either.
65.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not that old these days. No.
Yeah. So that's why, but the books like these, like the one you wrote, helps. I mean, it definitely, keeps the music alive, and it is out now. American Hairmetal, can't get enough, and you can find it where books are sold, and it's put together so beautifully. Feral House is the publisher. The photos are amazing, beautiful color photos, the way it's laid out. I mean, you got to be pleased with this.
Yeah, I've been with Feral House, since American Hardcore, so yeah, I believe in them, and they did an amazing job here. Yes.
Yeah. So
I
where can
mean,
people find you online if they want to reach out to you, Stephen? Do
if you
you have
want
a
to reach
website?
out to me, stephenblush.com, Stephen with a V, Blush. Um, and you could always reach me through Feral House, and support your local independent record and bookstore. But if you can't, the easiest and fastest, not best for me, but easiest and fastest is of course Amazon, which is omnipresent.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Stephen. This was
Yeah.
great.
Well, thank you for having me, Eric. I really appreciate it.